when someone is about to retire and they say, I can't lose everything I've worked so hard for, I'm like, I know what you're talking about in a deep way.
Welcome to the Freedom Point Real Estate Podcast, where we talk about creating more time freedom through passive real estate investing. Passive investing in real estate challenges conventional investment wisdom. We are passionate about learning and sharing resources with others who are ready to transform their investing mindset. Quick disclaimer as always, I am not a CPA, I am not an attorney or a financial advisor. This is not financial advice, not telling you or anyone else what to do. The views and opinions expressed in these podcasts are provided for education and informational purposes only and are not necessarily the views of my employer, ADP. I'm glad you're here. Now let's dig in.
All right, welcome back, Freedom Point Podcast listeners. Thank you again for jumping into another episode of the Freedom Point. We're so glad you're here with us again today. I've got another amazing guest. I know I always say I've got amazing guests, but this truly is an amazing guest. I've got Andrew McNair from SWAN Capital. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Oh, I'm so glad to be here. I'll try to live up to that expectation.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we kind of get started, I just want to maybe have our listening audience, learn a little bit more about you, learn a little bit maybe about your track record. I know you're an RIA in the space of, financial advising. And so we'd really like to learn a little bit more about maybe how you got started, what that journey's looked like, what you're focused on now, et cetera.
Yeah, absolutely. So I started in the financial industry at 14. My parents handed me a book called Rich Dad, Poor Dad. I'm sure some of your audience has listened or read that book. And I read that book and it flipped my world upside down. I really understood that book in a deeper level. I mean, my dad was a government worker. He was rich in integrity, but he was, not very rich financially. But I had friends because I went to private school that were the rich dads. And so I was like, I'm living this book. And I thought, if this book is true, then I should probably follow its advice. And I started asking my parents a bunch of financial questions, and they said, hey, you shouldn't be asking us. Let me introduce you to this Mr. Miyagi-like figure. And so this financial advisor locally said, I'll teach you everything you need to know about money, but you have to come here every day after school, work $0 an hour and do all the grunt work. And I thought, this is amazing. So after school, every day at noon, I would leave and work at the financial firm. Then at 18, I started seeing my own clients. At 20, I started SWAN Capital, and now nearly $500 million under advisement. Today, we have our own Signet real estate fund, as well as our own RIA that does estate planning, tax planning, and financial planning all under one roof.
That's great. Well, I definitely want to chop up your Signet fund a little bit more. But before we get there, I'd like to know a little bit more about SWAN Capital. I believe the mission of SWAN Capital is really to help families sleep well at night, right? The acronym SWAN, right?
That's exactly right.
Yeah, thank you. Can you maybe share with our listening audience a little bit more about what kind of inspired you to create this firm with that specific focus in mind?
Yeah, so SWAN Capital, Sleep Well at Night, came from my own frustration with money. So at 14, I was working at that financial firm, but I was also waiting tables at Denny's, and I'd saved up $62,000 by the time I was 16. So not bad for a punk kid waiting tables at Denny's. And I put it in the stock market, and I thought I had the Midas touch. My 62,000 turned into 142,000. So here I am, 18. I know everything about politics, music, religion. I got my money figured out. I have the Midas touch. So here I am. My head can't fit through a door. And the University of Hard Knocks, UHK, called into tuition payment. And it was $147,000. I actually ended up losing every single dollar of my original investment, which is actually impressive if you think about it. Most people lose like half their money. I lost all of it. And so that day, I just shook my hands with, all of my self-worth and net worth had went down at the same time. Like I put all my self-worth into my net worth and what I was accruing and how much money I made. And it all went down that night. And I thought, you know what, this is so sad because money never stays awake thinking about me. And here I am thinking about all the memories, the holidays, the weekends I gave up and I could never get back. And so specializing in retirement over the last, almost 2 decades, when someone is about to retire and they say, I can't lose everything I've worked so hard for, I'm like, I know what you're talking about in a deep way.
No, that's great. It's interesting. Your story is very similar to mine, although I think maybe the paths that we took were slightly different. The outcome was the same. Thinking back to my own, college days, right? And back in those days, online, trading of stocks was a thing, right? You could log in to your account and you could buy and sell and trade, stocks. And I remember all too well, thinking that I also had that Midas touch, writing those penny stocks up to $1 and making a 400% return on my investment, only to have it all be lost by the end of the week following, right? And I got so far into it thinking that I had the whole thing figured out, back in the .com, bubble days, right?
Oh, yeah.
That I started trading stocks, not only using my own college tuition, but also trading on margin. So when the bubble started to burst, those losses were exacerbated.
So scary. That was a scary time, and to be on margins, even scarier.
Yeah, absolutely. But lesson learned, of course. So my next question is I know that you emphasize the total wealth management. You integrate income, tax, healthcare, and estate planning into kind of your overall strategies. So what are some of the most common gaps that you see in clients' retirement plans, and how do you help them bridge those gaps?
Yeah, definitely. I'll just start with the estate planning. So, over a decade ago, I went and found an estate planning attorney that really had the same vision that we did, that, clients should not get, this conflicting advice that someone says you need to trust, and then someone says you don't need to trust, and then someone sells you a trust when you never needed a trust. And we sit down with clients, with the estate planning attorney, with the CPA, and say, hey, you don't have the legal documents that you need. I mean, I just met with a lady just yesterday that has $1.5 million, but no financial power of attorney. And I think, you have a 401k, you have an IRA, it's an individual retirement account. How can anyone pay your bills if you're demented or disabled? And she thought to herself, she's like, there's no way they could. That's right, because they have beneficiaries on their IRA. But if something happens to her, there's a gap right there that needs to be filled with the estate plan. So I find that's an issue all the time. Tax planning is a big one. I mean, I love real estate, and we can talk about my background with real estate, but I found that real estate is tax advantaged, but it's not necessarily tax free. And so that's why I'm a big fan of building a lot of tax free wealth and having your money tax diversified. But again, most people, they've worked with a financial broker and a professional that just talks about the investments. And I'm like, you have to have your investments diversified, and you also have to have your taxes diversified. So I would say tax and estate planning are massive gaps in most people's financial plan.
Yeah, this may be an opportunity for you to bring in, your passion for real estate investing and also the way that you coach and counsel your clients. But let's speak specifically now to that higher net worth individual where the mindset is, I'm going to pay off my dream home that I live in. That's part of my, overall net worth. I'm going to max out my 401k year over year over year. And maybe I'm going to dabble in the stock market and pick up a few index funds here or there. Why is that not the only methods that a higher net worth individual should choose to participate when they think about their overall investing strategy?
Yeah, I mean, diversification is age old. So if you have your money and your retirement income tied to the stock market, I always joke, you have your income on the left hand, you have your expenses on the right hand, and in between you have a bridge. And a lot of people's suspension bridge looks like the Indiana Jones movie, because if the market fluctuates, their income is directly fluctuating. So that's why I've always been a big proponent for retirees to have fixed income, to have guaranteed investments, to have the money in the market, but also to have real estate, because everything's cyclical. Interest rates are cyclical, the stock market's cyclical, and so is real estate. And so to have a one-legged stool where you're dependent upon just one thing, like a pension that hopefully is going to be there for you, or Social Security that you hope is going to have enough cost of living adjustments to keep up with inflation, is not the wisest approach. And so diversification, age old, and that's why when I started investing in real estate, I thought to myself, here I am, I'm professing that diversification is important, but I'm invested alongside clients. We manage our own SWAN portfolios in-house. It's not managed by an offshore manager. It's not managed in New York City. And I said, here's my money invested alongside clients. My income is tied to those results. I said, well, that's not really smart. I mean, if the stock market drops, my income's going to stop, or it's going to come to a real big drop. And so I started buying properties. And so I specialized at around like 21, 22. I started buying a couple houses a year. So I bought duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, and I bought them all in the Gulf Coast here where I live in Pensacola, Florida. And I ended up getting about 54 houses, 136 apartments, and it was really great. That it added that diversification piece that I needed for my financial plan, and that's why I've been a big fan of real estate ever since.
So let's unpack that a little bit. So I didn't realize that you have a background in active real estate ownership, and you coach and counsel, I would presume, your customer base to consider investing in real estate, but maybe doing it more on the passive side, right? So what are you still focused on actively managing real estate properties? Have you transitioned out of that? What was kind of the genesis behind that transition?
Yeah, I got up to that number and I started losing my hair. So those who are not watching the video version won't know that I have no hair. And I think they're correlated. I was very stressful when I was accruing all those properties because I would take basically a D property. No one would live there. And I made it a C and B property in my town. And it was becoming pretty much a nightmare of service. And I've had everything happen. I've had people burn my house down intentionally, burn it down accidentally. I've had people murdered in the front yard, murdered inside the house, front page news of our town. I've actually had people drive a car into my house. I one time was cleaning an apartment. It was just a stripper pole. She'd been there for the last 6 months. So I've seen it all with owning my own rentals. And I thought, well, this is not sustainable. If my original plan was to get to 200 houses, but I thought if I get to 200 houses, I think this might kill me. And so I thought there's got to be a better way. And so I wanted clients to take part in the success that I had because I had invested $3 million that turned into 10. And I thought I want clients to enjoy some of these potential returns as well. And so that's where I created the Signet Fund, CYG-NET, a baby swan. And that's where we specialize not just in one type of real estate like I made that mistake of, but 4 types of real estate in multiple geographic areas.
Yeah, that makes sense. Let's talk about the Signet Fund a little bit here. I'd love to hear your, kind of thoughts on, what are some of the main benefits that an investor can get investing passively into real estate that maybe differentiates that type of an investment strategy from just strictly Wall Street investing?
Absolutely. So I'm a big fan of passive and active. I still own some rental properties and I will probably always do. I think there's a benefit of active. It helps you appreciate and understand a lot of the financial numbers that are spoken about in passive, but a lot of people are busy professionals. And so the beauty of passive is that you're a silent owner. And it's nice to be a silent owner. No one's calling you saying, hey, can you change out the toilets this weekend? You get typically monthly or quarterly dividends, which is handy. I think it's really important to own a tangible asset. To own real estate, it's a real asset during an inflationary period is so incredibly important. The beauty, though, of a passive investment like Signet is that unlike where I had all my properties in one area, so one hurricane, one act of God could wipe those out. Also, I was in one type of real estate called multifamily, duplexes and triplexes. Well, with something like Signet, I'm invested in storage, flex industrial, apartment complexes, as well as short-term rentals. So anytime you can give that diversification with all of those benefits, it's really a big boost for that overall financial plan.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, I know that you don't have a crystal ball, Andrew, but I'd like to get your kind of take on this. At the time of this recording, we're entering towards the back half of August. By the time this episode releases, it'll probably be sometime in October. I know there's a lot of discussion about the Federal Reserve decreasing interest rates, which certainly would help, I would say, some operators in the space that maybe were over leveraged or maybe didn't protect their investors against the potential rise of interest rates, right? Hopefully that'll also perhaps maybe spur transaction volume, cap rates might, compress, valuations increase, just basically getting the market to start turning over these assets again. What's kind of your take on where we're at right now in the market? what you kind of are expecting as an individual investor as we move into the final few months of 2024?
Yeah, I mean, my crystal ball gets fuzzy after a day or so, but I would say and I just had our halftime report, which is on our YouTube channel, but I talked about the markets. And I think when it comes to the stock market, I think we're in very overvalued territory. If you look at the Buffett indicator, we're at 197%, two standard deviations above where the historical trend is. You have the Shiller PE ratio, which adjusted for inflation puts us at 36 times earnings. So anytime we get above 30, only bad things have happened in history, like the Great Depression, the dot-com crash, things like that, to name a few. And so if you look at the real estate market, I think the beauty of passive investments in a 3 to 5 year period in something like Signet or a real estate property is you're not trading stocks on a daily basis. You're not seeing the fluctuation of prices drop 30 or 40% in a 6-month period, which is another reason why real estate investing is so good, because you start thinking more long term. And again, everything's cyclical. And so cycles, you got to give those times 3 to 5. Now, the problem with what you talked about earlier is some of these bad operators, bad actors might just get saved by the Fed manipulating interest rates to their benefit, which again, hides some of the unprofessionalism, or it hides the lack of ability, which is what I get concerned about. And so that's why I'm judging the operators that we work with and the investments we're making now, because like if you're struggling now or if you're confused, it just means you're just not very experienced, because again, interest rates technically should have probably stayed higher for longer. And for people just to demand that they go down because they were so low a few years ago is actually ludicrous.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to get your take on the operator. Now, I know you probably have a very strict, due diligence process, that you go through, as you get to learn and study, the best in class operators in the space. But what would you say are your top 3 indicators that you look at when evaluating potentially partnering with sponsors?
Yeah, there's first and foremost is communication. I think if you're getting surprised, you're hearing it from other sources other than them, that's a really bad sign. If they are so off their business plan, that's a concern. It's because if you have a business plan, you have a pro forma, and you're way in the good of your pro forma, or you're way in the negative with your pro forma, just say, well, we didn't foresee interest rates going up, or we didn't foresee this. Well, that's the point of a business plan, is to try to see what can happen and plan accordingly, and say you have contingency plans. So I want to see how people have done in their previous. Have they had capital calls? Have they had to stop distributions? Why was that? And don't just blame the general economy, because you should have assumed that things are not always going to go your way. And most of the time they won't go your way. It's called life. And so we look at that. We also, because we're investing institutionally at that scale, we need to make sure that they have a track record. I hate it for the smaller operators that are merging. They have to start with friends and family. They have to slowly build up that reputation before we can make those larger investments into them.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Now, I know that because I followed you for a couple of years now, I know that you host your own podcast, you're a public speaker, you host a weekly radio show, and you've written, I believe, at least a couple of books on a wide range of topics. But what I'd like to focus on specifically is your perspective and really your encouragement to encourage others to give generously, right? Through tithing and other means. I'd love for you to just share your passion behind that.
Yeah, that was a pinnacle moment in my life where I was screaming into my pillow and punching my mattress at the age of 19 when I had lost everything. I learned a lot of financial lessons that night. Trial and error is a poor teacher, but it's a very good teacher. And it was probably the only teacher that would have shaken me to the core to realize that I needed to make some life changes. And so one was diversification, but one was more of a spiritual change of I had put my self-worth and all of my metrics of success into net worth and income, which is just another way of saying greed. And that's not a popular word anymore. It's not even a word we even use anymore. And I always like to talk about, in American culture, greed is an addiction that people will applaud you all the way to rehab. People will say, "You're doing great. Keep it up, Matt. Gosh, you're the pinnacle of the career in the industry that you're in, and he's my rich so and so." And they'll just say, and then you've built up this identity that's all based on moving goalposts of net worth and income. And I just don't want to waste my life, like Solomon talks about in Ecclesiastes, that like, here's a guy that devalued the entire worldwide silver market. Here's a guy that had 700 concubines. Here's a guy that had a pretty nice pad with his palace. And he said, it's all a big vanity. It's all a waste of time. And if you don't live by a more golden rule of love God, love your neighbor, and obviously love yourself after that. And so I had to learn really a very drastic, and I'm not asking everyone to follow in my footsteps by any means, but I had to do something pretty radical. I had to give all of my money away. And I continually try to give half my income or more away, because it's the only way that I know that I can keep that temptation of greed away, is to give it away.
Yeah, absolutely. And it brings, I'm sure, a tremendous amount of joy, not just in the people
Absolutely.
that you're blessing, but also you personally. So I appreciate you sharing that and being transparent with our listening audience. Well, Andrew, I'd like to know what's maybe next for you, personally, professionally. Have any major goals or bucket list items that you'd like to check off?
Yeah, that's such a fun question to answer. So for me, it's continually executing on our business plan here at SWAN Capital, is to help over 1,000 families retire and stay retired. So we're building that out, and Signet is a growing enterprise, and we're going to continually execute on that. So for me, a bucket list item, I've always wanted to go to Croatia. I've been to, I think, 41 countries. So I try to go to 2 new countries every year. So maybe Croatia and a few other countries next year will be on the list.
That's great. That's great. Well, if you're going to check them all off your list, you're going to have to increase the amount of countries you visit every year, unless you plan to live to 125.
That's right. I will tell you, there's probably about 20 countries that I have no business going, or no plans to go to anytime soon.
Yeah, that's right. We just, my wife and I just got back from Turkey. So we visited ancient Ephesus. And
Wow.
I asked the tour guide, give me a geography lesson here. Like, what countries are around us? What cities? He's like, well, Syria's over here. Iran's over there. I'm like, let's not go to those places maybe. And he says,
those are low on the list.
says they're safer than you might think. It's what you hear in Western media that gets a lot of the attention. So
yeah, some of the sweetest people I've ever met were Iranian that live here in the States. And it's just like anything. You got to be careful with the news. And it's like anything, when you travel, you got to, be safe wherever you're at. I mean, don't be foolish. And so I've had people say, you went there? And I'm like, it was actually very safe.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate, Andrew, the value that you've brought our listening audience today. So thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd like to give you one chance to maybe let our listening audience know, how they can connect with you to learn more about what you're up to.
Absolutely. So check us out on Amazon. My book is The Giving Crisis. It talks about how the average giving rate today is around 2%, while in the Great Depression, it was at 3%. So I take a deep dive into the giving crisis that we're living in right now. And I do think it's one of the answers to the anxiety, the depression, and potentially even the suicide that we see today. So check out The Giving Crisis on Amazon. If you want to learn more about SWAN Capital and the estate planning, tax planning that we do, go to swan-capital.com. And you can schedule a wealth review there.
That's great. Well, we'll definitely put those links in the show note for this episode. Again, Andrew, appreciate you joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me. Anytime.
Excellent. And listening audience, thank you again for jumping into another episode of The Freedom Point. We look forward to having you join us on the next episode.
Thank you for hanging out with us today and for listening to the Freedom Point podcast, powered by Starting Point Capital. This show is for entertainment purposes only. Nothing said on this show should be considered financial advice. Before making any financial decision, please consult with a professional. This show is copyrighted by the Freedom Point podcast. Written permissions must be granted before syndication or rebroadcasting. If you're interested in connecting, you can find contact information at startingpointcapital.com.